Good morning. My name is Madeline Funes. I'm with Mertech's marketing team. Welcome to today's Campfire. As many of you may already know, if you've been to other of our campfires, the event is intended to emulate a real campfire where people sit and chatter on the fire. This is an informal, live, and interactive session, and we usually focus on one specific topic of interest. And the whole idea is to teach and learn from each other about new technologies and how they affect our businesses. So we want to encourage active discussion. So if you have questions to ask about the topic or observations to share, please feel free to jump in. Today's Campfire will focus on JavaScript frameworks. There are many different frameworks out there on the market that strive to simplify application development, but they have different features, different aspects, making it very, very difficult to choose the one that's optimal for your project. So hopefully in this Campfire we can help you sort through some of the differences between all these options and get a little bit more perspective on how to choose the best solution for your development needs. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Oliver Nelson, who is a senior developer here, and he's going to kick off the discussion. Oliver?
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. We're gonna start this morning talking first about, in relation to all of these different JavaScript frameworks, a little bit of history. So to go back to where we need to begin here, we've got to go back to good old 1995. So around that year, and before that year, most websites were basically just static HTML pages. 1995 turned out to be a very seminal year in the world of HTML and JavaScript. In fact, that was the year that a programming language called LiveScript was first created, and it was created basically to help in with development of these websites where they wanted to have interactivity, and the only way they knew how to do that at that time was by way of Java. And but there were lots of these people developing websites that really didn't have a lot of experience with Java, and so LiveScript was created at that point to ease that. Now, that year also saw the creation of CGI scripting, or the Common Gateway Interface, which is a way, of course, to have server-side scripts or executables called so that a website isn't truly static. So we have both of these things that came out at the same point in 1995, but one of them just completely took over, and that was actually CGI. LiveScript kind of sat there because it was somewhat proprietary. Not all the browsers supported it. But CGI, because it was based on something on the server, any browser would work with a server that had CGI scripting in place. And so it really just took over and became huge because of that global compatibility. Now, also what ended up occurring was, as LiveScript was being developed, we also had Microsoft working on VBScript and JScript, but their implementations of those weren't really LiveScript compatible. There was only partial compatibility, and so you ended up with this split that ended up occurring. And after that, you had ECMAScript, which came out next, and ECMAScript tried to unify some of these feature sets between LiveScript and JScript. So you had all of this stuff that was occurring at the same time. Now, finally, JavaScript calmed down a bit and settled on some of the features that were in ECMAScript, and we finally did get to some sort of common ground that most browsers supported. Now we're going to jump forward to 1999. 1999, again, Microsoft was involved in this. We had the release of MS-XML, the first version of MS-XML that supported an ActiveX library called iXML HTTP request. Basically, this gave the web browser a way of sending HTTP data and receiving HTTP data via JavaScript directly in the browser. Now, that was something that you had to basically have installed on your computer, and first it only worked in Internet Explorer, and then other browsers added compatibility, and eventually that ended up going away for the most part and became built in to the web browser in later years as a feature called XHR. So that kind of moves us through what ended up occurring that caused all of this JavaScript framework stuff to exist. So when you look at these frameworks, now we need to look at why you necessarily would need to use a framework. So with all that history in mind, there's many issues that pop up with frameworks where they end up being able to fix for you cross-browser compatibility issues. So all of those different historical items change the way certain things work from an HTML perspective and from a technical perspective in JavaScript and in relation to HTTP request XHR. All of that got implemented slightly differently amongst the browsers, and so you have to do different things to make it work across all these browsers. One of the reasons people choose to use frameworks is so that they don't have to deal with that anymore. Secondly, because of the way LiveScript and JavaScript were developed, you ended up with somewhat of a Wild West sort of feel to JavaScript. JavaScript has become very, very capable in recent years. They've added all kinds of new feature sets to it, but it ended up being not too organized, and you ended up with a situation where for websites you had people that weren't necessarily developers that were writing, excuse me, that were building websites. So they didn't, they needed something that simplified things quite a bit so that they didn't have to deal with some of the lower level details. And so these frameworks provide that ability to get rid of some of that spaghetti code that came to be in many websites. And of course, the other item here is that as we got into, through history here with this, we get into the Web 2.0 days where we have more dynamic websites. You needed the ability to focus on your actual application rather than all of these different weird things that come up in JavaScript. So the idea of these frameworks is to basically unify your development environment across operating systems and browsers, and to make the development process much more streamlined. So what exactly comprises a framework, or and actually we have three separate terms here: a framework, a library, and a toolkit. So starting with a library. A library provides helper functions and abstractions to simplify your development process. So a library at its base gets rid of some of the oddities that are in JavaScript or in various browsers, and provides you with additional features, which could be related to things like data binding, or it could be related to ways of going through the document object model in a more efficient manner to find some element in your HTML. A toolkit actually provides user interface widgets and related UI functionality. So in this case, when you see all of these websites that have animation related to like page transitions or control transitions, and also custom tree views and all of these things that aren't built into HTML, those are being provided in most cases by way of these third-party toolkits that basically just abstract away all of the HTML that is required to build that and give you an interface to work with that's much simpler. Now when we look at an actual framework, we're actually looking at basically a full stack that combines both the functionality you would normally find in a library or series of libraries, along with all of the widgets and their related implementations. And you end up with, in most cases, you end up with a more unified structure to work from because, of course, they were built from the ground up to interact with each other well. So you can look at some specific libraries and use them with various toolkits, and in most cases you'll be okay. Some things may not work though. If you choose to go with a complete framework, you know that all of that stuff is going to interact very well. And So you end up in a little bit easier to deal with situation, but of course the trade-off is that you have to buy into, you know, their way of doing things essentially, since you're using their entire stack. So how do you decide what to go with on any of this? Don't worry, you weren't meant to be able to see the text on here. This is just a table that we pulled out from Wikipedia that lists actually a very small number of the JavaScript frameworks and some of the features that they implement, some of the browsers that they have good compatibility with, and how they compare to each other. And honestly, this is a small subset of them. This JavaScript page that I found, I mean, it looks like it lists here somewhere around, I don't know, 15 or 18. There are many, many, many more libraries, toolkits, and frameworks than this. The numbers are just actually a bit staggering. So how do you actually make a choice on any of these? Well, we're going to break it down a little bit and look at a small sampling of some of these. In this case, we're breaking things down into those that are full frameworks, that are widget-based frameworks on the left there, and on the right we have those that are more along the lines of just libraries. So in this case, the ones also here that are in gold are the ones that really are actually more popular toolkits. Now, in this list, we've taken just literally a small handful of them and decided to look at those individually. This list is actually huge. If you find articles that talk about various frameworks, a lot of times, you know, it may be a roundup of 15 or 20 frameworks, and down in the comments you'll see like 35 or 40 more frameworks listed. It's pretty amazing that way. So we're going to look at, out of this list, we're going to look at about 6 of these and kind of see what they're capable of. So I'm going to switch over here to my browser tab, and the first one we're going to look at is a framework called Backbone. Now, Backbone is truly, it's actually a low-level sort of JavaScript framework. A lot of times, one of the ways you may choose to evaluate some of this is actually based on how the website looks. If the website tends to be like this, where it's you know, paragraphs of text and a very simple look to it, a lot of times that's going to be a lower-level framework that is more targeted on the developer. And that's definitely the case with Backbone. Backbone's actually very popular, though, because of the sort of low-level key value binding model that it provides, and it's been around quite a while. One of the other things that's very nice about this is that Backbone is very small. So when you're evaluating these, size can also be a concern because, of course, you have to download this entire framework to use it. So for development, you can see here for Backbone, we're looking at 58 kilobytes. And for production, we're looking at 6.3K. So it's smaller than most images you're going to be using here. And along the left here, you can kind of see some of the various pieces of it that are implemented here. And you'll notice here we've got specific sections: model, collection, router, view. Most of these frameworks that we're looking at are based on an MVC model view controller structure. So you end up with a very similar situation amongst most of these. With when you go to compare them, at least they'll be based on the same thing that way. So Backbone, pretty low level, widely used. It tends to be one of those frameworks that if you want to build everything yourself from the ground up, this is going to be a good choice for you. But there's going to be a lot of stuff that isn't provided here, which means that you may end up having to grab your own widget library for it, and a lot of the stuff related to CSS and things like that, you're going to want to look for other solutions for those pieces of your project. So, but Backbone is one of the most widely used ones. Angular.JS is another interesting one here. This is Google's solution, and Angular is more of a expressive sort of framework. You end up with this very cool binding method that they have in here, where, let's see if I can find the piece I was looking at here. Angular templates, here we go. You end up with this very simple binding method in Angular where essentially you create HTML and you use these custom tags in HTML to say what pieces of the project are linked to data on the back end and how they're linked. So in this case, they're defining the body as a controller in an MVC model just by way of this tag. So it's a very declarative style of framework. What that ends up meaning when you go to look at it from some other standpoint is that it is not dynamic. So if you wanted to do something that was built on the fly, for instance, rather than a more static user interface sort of thing, Angular probably isn't going to be the best choice for you. It's built with this declarative model rather than a programmatic model in mind. When you go to try to use it programmatically, it can be very difficult. The difference there between declarative and programmatic, this ends up being a declarative interface where you're writing the HTML and defining various pieces of it in here. And you'll see lots of places that end up using something like this in here. A programmatic approach is going to be where you actually build your user interface or controls or elements in JavaScript itself. So this framework is focused on doing it the other way, declarative, not programmatic. But doing it this way means you end up with a very easy to read interface. It's very easy to understand the layout of a page just at a glance, really. So one of the other things that's nice about Angular is it has very good support, and the documentation is some of the best that's out there, actually. The next one we're going to look at is called Ember.JS. If you've looked at frameworks in the past, this one was actually called Sprout Core in the past. And it's a really, really odd framework, or library in this case. But it's got some good street cred, actually. Ember, when it was called Sprout Core, was actually used to develop Apple's entire mobile me interface. And Apple's used it for a few other projects on their website. The guys who started Sprout Core and changed it to Ember actually were originally Apple engineers, and what they created ended up being so usable that Apple implemented it on theirs, whereas a lot of times companies of that size would choose to roll their own or use one of the more established packages. Ember isn't very well established. It's somewhat young from that standpoint, and it's a very weird interface. And the reason I say that, if you look at this down here, you can kind of see what I mean here. Again, you use these handlebars, this handlebar interface to control basically the dynamic creation of HTML. So in this case, we have a people controller here that we're going to be doing a loop on, and we're going to be inserting a LI, which is a list item, for each one of those. So that essentially builds HTML on the fly for you. And you may recognize this as something that you would expect to see on a server-side interface. And you'd be right. This is definitely something that normally you would see being done on like PHP on the server side, but this is being done on the client side in JavaScript. So it ends up being a somewhat odd interface, allowing you to do those sorts of things that normally would have been done using CGI or something like that in the browser directly. So again, this is more of a, if we were to go back over here, Ember doesn't have a widget class. So in that case, we're dealing with a situation where you would have to find the widgets yourself. but from the standpoint of actually building HTML on the fly, very capable here. Certainly one to keep in mind. And as you can see here, their list of who's using it has really grown recently to include some very important ones. One of the ones that I found most interesting in this list was Discourse, which is a project by a guy named Jeff Atwood. And anyways, it's a sort of discussion forum, and building it on something like that, really shows the power of Ember.js building this, huge sort of discussion forum on that software. The next one we're going to look at is Dojo. Now this one I can talk about a little bit more because I've actually been using this one recently in a project. So you might ask, how did I decide on this one? Well, I was in a situation where I needed to use a full framework because I was going to be doing a project that was fairly large, and I didn't want to have to worry about bringing in different libraries and toolkits together and making sure they were going to work on a very large scale. And so Dojo was really the choice for me in this case. And so in the full framework, one of the things that you get with Dojo that's pretty cool is that not only do you have browser compatibility, as you can see across just about everything, but Dojo also has a very rich set of user interface widgets that work well on mobile devices. So you end up with an interface that you can use on an iPad or a Galaxy tablet, or these tablets that pretty much don't exist anymore over here. So it ends up giving you this sort of very rich interface to use that has, in this case, a very small core to it. When you start with Dojo, it's even smaller than that first one that's low-level Backbone. Dojo's 3.8K at a minimum. And then the way they work is that you actually load dynamically on the fly the various pieces that you need for your specific project. So it's very capable that way. And the documentation ends up being quite rich. The one thing I can say about it, they have this API interface here that exposes all of their different things. Documentation, we're going to mention it later, but documentation ends up being really key to this stuff, especially if you're somewhat new to it. And how the documentation is laid out is really important. Now, looking at this, you can dig in here and see they just have loads and loads of stuff. If I were to go into like Digit, which is, of course, you don't know what that means, but Digit is their UI controls, their widgets. You can see here there's quite a range of things here. The one problem that you'll see here is that there really isn't a good search in here, and that can really be problematic from the standpoint of using their stuff. We've had plenty of situations in this project that we're in where it's hard to find what we need because it's so rich that it can dig through it and get the different pieces that you need. So documentation and how it's laid out ends up being a very important consideration. One of the things about Dojo that's pretty cool, there's this other project called Maqueta that actually gives you a way of building Dojo user interfaces on the fly. It's essentially a GUI design tool for Dojo. We didn't end up using it on the project that I've been working on just because it didn't work out quite well for ours, but essentially this is a in-browser development studio for building Dojo user interfaces. So that's a big advantage to Dojo that some of the others don't have. So, looking at how you actually go about development ends up being an important consideration also. Next up, we're going to take a look at one many of you will have heard of called jQuery. jQuery is one of the most widely distributed libraries for JavaScript that's out there. And again, jQuery, if you look here, it's fairly large, 32 kilobytes when you compare it to some of the others. jQuery is very, very powerful. It's kind of hard to describe jQuery properly without digging into it more, so I'm not really going to attempt it. But there ends up being a very rich plugin environment for jQuery, even though it's just a library. So if we were to go back here, you see I have jQuery listed as no widgets. But on the left, I've got jQuery UI. jQuery UI is a plugin for it that provides that widget interface. And in fact, there's tons and tons of plugins for all kinds of stuff that have been developed for jQuery. Has one of the richest third-party environments out there. So it ends up being worth looking at just from that standpoint alone. But of course, there's a risk with that because instead of being dependent on one project or one product here, you end up having these dependencies all over the place. So you end up having to deal with a different set of forums, for instance. If there's a problem with one of the widgets, you need to go on jQuery UI. And it can just kind of get out of hand quickly that way. So it's something to keep in mind. But even on the project that I've been working on where I'm using Dojo, jQuery provides so much power that we decided to use this library even though we have a full stack over here with Dojo. We use jQuery just for some of the pieces because they have these plugins that let you do some really cool stuff. So in our case, we're using it for like providing sprintf functionality and some things like that in our user interface. So jQuery is a great one, but you need to look at some of the plugins for it. And one of the other considerations is that jQuery is very light on the MVC interface because it is just a library. So some of the stuff related to how you access your data is a little different there. The last one we're going to take a look at is really the other one that I've considered for various projects, and I'll probably end up using this at some point in the future, YUI. Now, this is a Yahoo engineered product. Has its origins at Yahoo. They put it out there as an open source project. And one of the areas that it really shines is in their support for effects. They have amazing grid-based interfaces, drawing-based interfaces, and animation effect interfaces. It's very capable of for building full projects in. There's nothing that stops you there. They have good mobile support also, and you end up with this big community that's available to you for them also. So they have a full forum environment that you'll see has decent number of posts on it. You can get help from them easily. YUI has some of the richest user interface controls also. And module interfaces, of course, they allow third-party tie-ins also. So it's definitely one of the bigger ones to consider. It is on the downside a little bit heavier. I don't think they put quite on their front page how much it weighs to include in your project. And that's partially because it is one of the little bit bigger ones, and so it can be a little bit slow loading. But it certainly is one to consider for your project, just based on having controls for just about everything, and all of their controls are touch aware. So those are some of the major ones out there that I wanted to bring out to you guys. The ones I chose there, I chose based on some of my exposure to them, and of course my concern with this has always been what works with the backends that I'm using. And so when you look at some of this stuff, one of the things you won't see mentioned on here is what data access is providing for the VDF community out there. Now, of course, they have essentially their own toolkit. And what I've ended up doing, since I want some of the abilities that they just don't have in their toolkit, in fact, theirs is a full framework. What I end up doing is just taking a small piece out of theirs, and in the case that I'm working on now, we use their SOAP abilities that are built in to interface with a web app via SOAP, but then we're using Dojo as the front end. So that's another consideration that I know many of you have. These other frameworks that are out there end up having thousands of people or tens of thousands of websites that are using them, and in many cases they have hundreds of developers also. So you end up with this situation where almost anyone can provide you with support, and that's a very valuable thing. So Next up, what happens when you're targeting mobile? Well, I'm just going to spend a minute on this. These are some of the various frameworks that are out there for the mobile environment. Sencha is becoming quite popular, and JQ Touch also is a big one. Titanium is a little bit unique in that it is a JavaScript environment, but you actually get to compile to a native either iOS or Android type project. So it's a little bit of an odd one out there. It is JavaScript based, and I don't know if I would really consider it a framework. It's more of a full development environment that ends up being cross-browser compatible. The end project I don't have a lot of experience with. I did get to look at it briefly, and it looks very interesting, and I know it's one of the up-and-coming ones. And this last item here, of course, you'll be able to get this you know, in our slides after the webinar, but this is a really great article that goes over quite a few of the different mobile development frameworks that are out there. So if you're interested in it, it's fairly up-to-date too, published in November of 2012. So it's an interesting one there. When you're looking at a mobile environment, of course, some of the other projects are very mobile capable. As I mentioned, Dojo is, YUI is also. These ones are really focused solely on mobile, and so they don't work quite as well in other environments. Okay. Next up, how do you actually select a project to use? Well, in this case, you may be selecting based on features. If there's something specific, of course, you need, or you need a very rich development environment, you know, you're going to be limited on what you can use. YUI ends up being probably one of the richest out there. Dojo, of course, also is that way. So if you're looking for a very rich environment that way, then those are your choices. If you have a real capable developer that is familiar with the ins and out of CSS3, HTML5 interactions and can build some of that on their own, or you have custom interface you want to build, sometimes those other ones can be a bit heavy. The visual design tool availability is something I've used as a criteria also. In this case, that was one of the reasons I considered Dojo, is that we could at least do some prototyping with that Makeda tool. There are a couple other ones out there that have some visual design tools available for them also. It's something to consider, especially if you're just starting with some of these. Having a design tool that builds some of it for you can be very helpful. The maturity of the product, of course, can be very important. As I mentioned, Ember.js is one that kind of stands out because realistically it's not that old from any perspective, and yet it's been used by some very big companies and on very big projects. So maturity isn't necessarily something that you have to look at, but in general, as these projects get more mature, you'll find two things that occur. Either they disappear entirely because people have stopped using them, and so you're going to find some that are old, but just because they came out, you know, long ago doesn't mean that you should be using them. You also want to look at how active that community is in that case. And then you'll find others that are brand new that are just getting tons of activity. So it's something to consider, but of course you don't want to look at just that aspect. Documentation for me is my single biggest item that I look at. And having that rich documentation, especially if you're not a, you know, expert developer in this field, having good documentation is going to be very important. And some of these projects really can be quite light on documentation. So for me, that's ruled out various items before because I don't have the time or the willpower or the want to dig into their projects specifically to figure out things that aren't well documented. And of course, the community that you have available to you can be very valuable. In many cases, you can find answers on sites like Stack Overflow for various problems you may have, but if they have a community of their own, it can be very helpful to use that as your first line of defense when you hit a problem. And this last item here, very important. In fact, I think it's probably one of my favorite new websites that I've come across recently, To Do MVC. So this, since most of these frameworks are based on MVC and most of these libraries have that, this is a really cool website. They take a simple to-do project, which is basically just this. It's a very simple to-do list that you can check items off of. You can look at which ones are completed or active. And they take that interface and they give you that same project built in all of these different frameworks and libraries, all with the same user interface. It's going to look the same across all of them. So if they've had to do things like custom CSS because that project doesn't support it or whatever, you're going to be able to compare that implementation for that project across all of these different frameworks. And really, the number here is quite high, as you can see. They're implementing it for tons of different ones, but this isn't all of them. And in fact, if you go down here to the bottom where they show their news, you'll see that they have 18, and this just is of February of this year, 18 stable apps and 36 in the labs that they're working on right now. So you can see the richness there. They're waiting for people to submit ones for different frameworks that they don't have yet. And in fact, these guys even look at frameworks that instead of being pure JavaScript, compiled to JavaScript, such as Dart. And they have, let's see here, I think a couple of these are based on, I think like Batman, for instance, is based on CoffeeScript, yeah. So that framework actually ends up being compiled to JavaScript from CoffeeScript. And they also look at it from the standpoint of real-time interfaces that they have here, which is a little bit of a different type of website design. So definitely something to look at. Gives you a great comparison. You can see how simple it is in various ones. And basically what you can do here is you can download their entire project somewhere in here. Here we go, right at the top. You can download the entire project, and basically it gives you the code for all of the different JavaScript frameworks in one download to do a comparison with. So if you're looking at various items for your specific project, this is the place to turn. And that's pretty much it. That's what I had to go over with you guys. You know, if you have any specific questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. And so, you know, it's like I said, it's a rich environment. Hopefully this has given you some idea on some of the considerations that I use to decide on a framework. And I know this kind of just is the tip of the iceberg on it, but, you know, hopefully it'll help you in some way there.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. That was a great presentation. So this kind of wraps up the structured part of our program. So I want to open it up to questions and comments. You can either click the raise hand button if you'd like to speak, or you can type into the question window what your question is, and we'll address it to Oliver. And we look forward to any questions, any comments, any observations, any experiences that any of you have had on using JavaScript.
I'm curious if anyone has you know, implemented, used any of these themselves, and you know, has feedback on it. I can certainly say, having used Dojo, that you know, it has its parts that aren't that great. You know, I've found those things that aren't quite right, and they can be in really weird spots. Like we've had this funky problem with date fields there and defaults for date fields, and it seems like they you know, have this sort of weird epic implementation for that doesn't quite work right. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a date picker, it's not a new control, and yet, you know, they're still having problems with it after 5 years. So I think on all of these projects you're going to find some odd things like that, but you know, that's pretty much any programming environment.
So Oliver, I'll ask the first question. So you mentioned earlier on, you started talking about the MVC model and how a lot of the frameworks use that model. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is and why that's important for JavaScript frameworks. And then also I've heard some other terms, which is MVVM, I believe. It seems that each framework has sort of a different variation of it. So can you explain that a little bit further?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So an MVC interface is it stands for Model View Controller, and basically almost all of these projects use an MVC model because of the way that they have to go to the back end to access their data anyways. So in most cases, people are going to be accessing their data via either JSON style JavaScript object notation, or they're going to be accessing it, via that using REST, or they may be using SOAP or something like that. So one way or another, there's going to be essentially an exposed user interface for the data that you then have to bring into your project and somehow attach to your user interface. So in an MVC model, that back end where you have your data there and its representation in the JavaScript ends up being the model, and the view ends up being the user interface that you expose in HTML, and then you have the controller, which ends up acting as a way of binding the data to the user interface. So it's basically what the application does ends up being the controller in this case. So when you look at, now some of these implement different models. There's also an MVP, model view presenter, and but the one you mentioned there, MVVM, which is kind of a Microsoft creation, stands for model view and then view model, which is grouped together. It's not just repeating the words in the opposite order, even though it's just repeating the words in the opposite order. And so this is a Microsoft thing that's almost the same as a controller. The difference between them is that when you're looking at a controller, you really are looking at what your user interface does, whereas in a view model you end up with a situation where it's a container for both the data and the actions together in the view model portion of it. And in fact, a view model is tied to a very specific view, so you end up being bound directly, whereas in its classic MVC model, the controller may be independent from the actual view. So a little bit different scenario there. We've got a couple other questions here. One of them is on, let's see here, from Andrew on Twitter's Bootstrap. And no, actually, I haven't gotten a chance to look at Bootstrap at all. In fact, I just read something about it just the other day. Do you have a mic at all, Andrew, that I could enable so that maybe you can tell us a little bit about it? No, sorry. Okay. Well, no, I haven't gotten to look at that one much at all. I just have read about it very briefly just the other day. We have another individual, Simon Gottschalk, who is actually doing some prototyping with XJS along with VDF and Oracle. And XJS is kind of another big one out there. In fact, let's here we go. I want to look at the XJS is basically got tied in together with Sencha about a year and a half ago, I think. Year and a half ago. So Sencha ends up being, I mentioned that on the mobile portion, and but they ended up tying together with XJS because they were dependent on it before anyways, and so now they're kind of a unified interface. And this is a really capable system that actually more closely matches what Data Access has done with their framework. So you end up with a more of a windowed sort of approach to it, and as you can see here, they call it a web desktop. And so somewhat similar to what Data Access is doing is the approach that they've taken here. So kind of an interesting one. Curious how what your experience has been with that, Simon. Is there a chance you have a mic at all that we could enable? Okay, let me switch on your mic. You there, Simon?
Hi, greetings from very wet and cold South Wales in the UK.
Thank you.
I've been playing around with XJS for a while. I'm redeveloping a fairly major application used in several governments around the world. Some of the things that I wish I'd heard this presentation from you 2 years ago before I started about a year's worth of investigation myself. So if there are people out there who are just sort of starting this journey, then your presentation was fantastic, a fantastic introduction. So thank you for that. Yeah, basically I've been trying to hook in a JavaScript framework into Visual Data Flex. The back end for me has to be independent. I'm using Oracle for some clients, Native Dataflex for others, and some people ask for SQL Server. So database independence is important. As a long-standing VDF person, that's my programming language of choice. I guess I'm just too old to learn anything new. The documentation issue is huge. It is so hard just to learn some of this stuff if you've not experienced anything like it before. And I spent a lot of time in bookshops 2 years ago, trawling Amazon, buying books, and going through them. And one of the other problems is that books go out of date very quickly and documentation goes out of date.
That's true.
XJS 3, if you actually pick up a book on XJS 3, the publication date will have tended to be about a week before XJS 4 came out, and then you'll see the author say, oh, well, actually, everything I've just written in that book has now been superseded. So you have to watch out for that in books. But, of course, all the documentation you really need is online, and even some of the books I've got now on XJS, they're not bothering to publish them in hard copy. What they do is you buy effectively a subscription to the book, and they keep updating the chapters, which does seem like a better way of doing it. I'm curious if anybody out there has actually been working away with VDF 17 web framework in anger. I know it's on alpha, or I think it's beta release, and in about a month's time in the UK we're going to have a presentation on it from Data Access, I believe. But I don't know if anybody that's listening has actually got some practical experience with it, because I'd be curious to know what the differences are.
Well, I've used it a bit, Simon. You know, I've looked at it a little bit here, and in fact, you know, if XJS is the, you know, what you went with, it's actually a very apt comparison between the two of them, because XJS really has taken, you know, Data Access has taken a very similar model to what they have, where essentially you're viewing it as almost like a replacement for a you know, that sort of MDI view dialogue sort of thing, right? And basically they've taken that sort of approach with Data Access entirely, where it works very well if you're looking at creating a replacement for a, you know, a true thick client. And I think it basically, if you're using Data Access as stack as your back end, it ends up being a, you know, an easier to use interface, certainly. The problem, I think, can come in when you look at the fact that, you know, with Data Access's solution in comparison to like XJS, you know, you're going to end up with more richness, probably even fewer bugs somewhat, I would say, on the XJS model, just because of the sheer volume of people that are using and working on it. And there's value in that. So, you know, I mean, I think it's a very tough decision to decide between those two items. You know, what you would want to do that way, because XJS really is a good system. It was one I considered, but even for the project I've been working on, but it didn't fit well just based on the design of the project. It wasn't, you know, I was doing something that was more along the lines of a high-end wizard sort of interface that I've been working on, so it didn't really fit well. But you know, very interesting all the same that they've gone down the same path.
Okay, well, I mean, I didn't realize that what they're doing, and so I haven't looked at what they've been doing, and we'll see more later on. I think it's middle of April. That it's interesting that it's a similar path. What you're saying about being able to use XJS to replicate what in effect is an old Windows type implementation of Visual done in Visual Dataflex is absolutely spot on. I've actually done that. I've literally taken a fairly old Windows application, and I haven't tried to change anything really. I've just tried to redevelop the whole thing using an XJS approach. So the panels are the same, the prompts are in the same places, even the menu's the same. And it was interesting. That mapped on pretty easily. So if you actually are upgrading an existing product, it is a Windows product, it's actually quite a good way to go. I don't know if anybody else out there has got any views on that, but if you're under pressure to deliver something as well to customers, you don't want to go reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for your feedback on that. Yeah, how long did you say you've been developing in the XJS?
I still consider myself a complete novice, but I actually sort of took the package on about getting on 2 years ago. Just when XJS 4 literally got released, 4.0, and I spent best part of 6 to 9 months evaluating the XJS and various other products. Products that are outside the scope of, I think, this presentation, but I was looking at other database products as well as different intermediary products. XJS appealed to me fairly early on, and so I started to do some serious prototyping with it. The first problem I had was interfacing it with Dataflex web services. The only interface that Dataflex provided at the time was SOAP. And of course I wanted to use JSON. But actually I got quite a bit of help from other people in the Dataflex community, and that was solved fairly quickly. And subsequently VDF 17.1 Alpha also had all that included. So now you've got the ability to interact with interface with SOAP or JSON. I've been asking Data Access for a REST interface as well, but I guess I'll have to ask them that again in about 4 weeks' time. So it's been a sort of 2-year journey, but as I said, there's more than just. I was looking at redeveloping a major product, all aspects, not just the user interface. I know you did a Campfire that I could listen to on NoSQL, was it?
Yes.
A while ago. I missed that one, I'm sorry, but one of the things I looked at for a long time was MongoDB and played around with that a little bit. Yeah, that was something else I evaluated. One of the interesting things in my evaluation, if there are any other VDF people out there, is that 2 years ago I thought I'd look seriously at something other than VDF as my middleware, and it took 18 months to get to a sort of conclusion as to what I needed to use. But I came down in favor of VDF for literally preservation of existing code, product that I knew, and a community out there that I know quite well. So that became a major factor.
Yeah, as I mentioned, even on this stuff, community documentation, those sorts of things really are insanely important. I mean, they matter so much. There was one other question we had on here related to. We got a question related to licensing, and I did want to mention something on that real quick, just in case any of you have thought about that aspect. A lot of this stuff is free, right? I mean, realistically, you can use most of it the way you want. The licensing with some of this stuff is basically you're going to see a couple of different licensing models. The main one that you're in, there's I think probably 3 main licenses that you see for this stuff. One of them is a Creative Commons Attribution license. The second one is the LGPL license, and the third one is called an MIT license. And about 70% of these are going to be based on an MIT license, which essentially lets you do almost anything you want with it. You can take it and use it in your product that is a for sale product. The LGPL allows you to do that also, but it has restrictions on if it's a derivative work. So if you're doing something that is, basically you're taking a certain framework and you are putting a layer on top of it, and you wanted to sell it as your own framework, they limit you in doing that, so you're not allowed to do that. And the CC attribution license basically is similar to the MIT one, but it has some requirements related to actually, listing them on like a credit screen, and basically making clear who, that part of your project was provided by, this framework. And there's many different versions of that one, so you kind of have to look at it. So when you're going to use one of these, the MIT license ones are probably your best bet, because you essentially don't have to worry about it. The other ones, you at least want to take a look at if you are considering a derivative work, then MIT license is the only way to go. If you come across the other two, they sometimes have a couple other requirements with, if you've modified the code, you have to make the code available, that portion of their product that you've modified. So there's a couple little things that way. Let's see here, and that appears to be all the questions we have. Madeline, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So I guess that wraps up our session. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We typically record these sessions, and they'll be available on YouTube. We send out the link in the newsletter, and it also goes up on our website. The slides will also be available on our website at some point next week. So please feel free to check it out, and that goes for the other the past campfires that we've had as well. They are up on the website right now if you've missed them. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully this was a very helpful session for you. I thought it was very informative for me, Oliver, so thank you for your presentation. So that's about it. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.